G'day folks, Mark here again. I've got a video that's inspired by a few of the comments that we got on the, or a fair few of the comments that we got on the Stop Doing This, which is actually talking about sighting in a rifle on a lead sled. Well, really it was just talking about, the video was about, you should sight in a rifle as you're going to use it. Your zero will actually change. In most cases it'll change, so you should sight in a rifle as you actually use it. And there was the people who don't believe that, and there was the people, just as many of the people who can't find the right way to explain that to people. They see the problem happen again and people can't understand what the difference is. And the logic of the people, whether the ones they're trying to talk to or the ones that actually have this logic, is that it should simply be a maths problem, a trigonometry problem. It should just simply be a vector between where the scope's pointing and where the barrel's pointing. There's obviously gravity involved and the parabolic curve of the bullet falling that's involved, so your distance should change. And there's obviously weather and wind and all that sort of stuff. But otherwise, if you've got those two things should simply line up all the time, because the scope should be pointing where the barrel's pointing. And that's the simple logic of it. And as much as in a very simple sense, that's right, in a accuracy and an actual physics sense, it's wrong. They don't actually work that way. So what am I saying? Well, what I'm actually saying is that to start off with, there's a couple of details to go through with the barrel. The length of the barrel, where the actual whole barrel is pointing, is not exactly where the bullet is going to go. The bullet travels down there. Yes, the barrel's got the rifling to get it spinning. It's got the efficiencies of it, the length of it, all that sort of stuff to get it to use the expansion of that gas to get up to speed. But the actual direction of it is with the last 4 inches or inch or even right down to the tip is the actual direction of it. So the moment you have the rifling a little different, or the bore a little different, or I've got videos on the crown how important that is. The moment you have any deviation there whatsoever, even half a thou over an inch of difference there is going to put the bullet to a different place. Most people with experience realize that, yeah, bore sighting sometimes is quite a way away from where you actually sight the zero to, or sight the scope to. But that's just the way it is sometimes. But for this video, for this explanation, let's go with all that's perfect. Everything's perfect. Your crown's perfect, everything's perfect, the barrel's perfect. Still doesn't mean the bullet's going to go exactly where the barrel was pointing. And that is because the barrel was pointing is exactly the problem we've got here. There is a couple of things that go on, and this is the simple thing, is that when the trigger breaks, so when that round goes off, there is time between when it starts to travel and when it ends up. There is time for things to have happened to where that muzzle was pointing, where that barrel was pointing, particularly the muzzle. Those things are in recoil control, and those things are in what can be called harmonics. A better way to describe it for this is shock. There is shock traveling down there. So what can happen? Yes, regardless of what you might believe, the simple laws of physics means the action of recoil starts prior to the bullet leaving the barrel, because it starts when the bullet starts traveling. So that means it may be undiscernible by anything whatsoever in the way of what you can see, but it is the difference. It's why you'll see with a handgun, you'll see differences of point of impact with how tightly they're gripped on occasions with different handguns and that sort of stuff. It's, I suppose, without getting into the details, I'll go further into those details later on, but the simple physics says the barrel has to start moving. The whole rifle has to start moving the moment the bullet starts moving. Might only be microscopic, but still, there's one of your movements. Or point of impact movements. The other one is shock. There is when that explosion, when that rapid expansion of gas of the bullet firing goes off, then there's actually shock, like a hammer blow of shock that's actually happening in the barrel. And that means, and I don't know if it's 10 times or it's 100 times faster, that shock travels up, hits the front of the barrel, or the muzzle of the barrel, and back down, and it starts ricocheting around and all over the place. So it's like if you grab yourself a heavy bit of steel and hit it with a hammer, even though that steel can't move. Let's say you got a hard bench, you hit it. If you grab and hold tight, as most people have done, you're holding onto a drift or a cold chisel or a bar or whatever it is, and you're holding it there and someone's trying to drive something, hit here. If you hold it tightly, hold it wrong, you'll end up with your hand hurting. you visibly won't have seen that drift, that piece of steel move, but it's the shock that's traveling through it. Well, the same thing at the same level of force as a very heavy hammer blow, or maybe even a little more than a very heavy hammer blow, is shock traveling up that barrel. So there's vibrations. Now, once again, might not be visible, but those vibrations mean that that barrel could be in any particular place, in microscopic levels, but that's what we're talking about. And I suppose that's one of the details that I'll quickly segue back to, is that when we're talking about sighting and we're talking about the accuracy of sighting, we're talking about very small differences. And that is 1 inch or 1.5 inch or 2 inches, sometimes it's even more, but a 1 inch different at 100 yards or 100 meters. So that is a small difference to an average shooter who just wants to be able to hit rabbit at 50 yards, then listen, it doesn't really matter, you're not going to pick it up. But once you go to precision, and when you're talking about zeroing your scope and you're talking about long range, be it hunting or be it any form of what you're actually doing, once the distance starts to get out there, that accuracy starts to matter. That's what we're talking about. And what we're actually referring to is that in the logic of you just sight a scope to a stationary object where everything's sitting still, then okay, that's pretty simple. But when you understand that a rifle is dynamic, both because of recoil control and because of shock, and actually because of the physical movement of the body, means that actually the process of firing a firearm, the firearm is a dynamic creature. It's actually doing stuff. Very small stuff, but it's doing stuff. And that's why sighting matters. Now, what I want to go through and explain some of those things, that there's still people who will go with, okay, I've heard all that before, or I basically understood that. How can you prove that? What can you actually prove? Show me a video of it. Well, showing you a video of foul movements and things like that on something that's already moving regardless is going to be something beyond me. But you already know this. You've already experienced all these things. You just haven't put them together. So I've got a list of bits and pieces which I'll go through as to what we're talking about. To start off with, not too many people haven't shot a 22. Not too many people a 22 rimfire, so a long rifle. Most people who've done any trying to make their one shoot properly have gone through and found that it likes a particular ammo. And like there's some magic to the fact that it's just this one likes that ammo. Have you ever thought about what that actually is? What it actually is, to the largest degree, is harmonics, or that shock traveling down that barrel. When the simple logic this includes in load development, and this talks about nodes, and this also is in the world of barrel tuners and all that side of things. And what's actually talking about is that shock, that frequency up and down. We look at it waves, but it's actually when those shock hits up there, that vibration ends up with the barrel moving. And this is a very exaggerated thing of a thou or so of movement in those vibrations at super high speed. There's a point where it goes out to the extremity and then comes back in. When it's out in the extremity, it's at its stillest because it has to go out and come back. When it's going through the middle, it's at its broadest. So it's going to moving the most at that point. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's normally shown as up and down. No, it could be any direction. It could be absolutely any direction of where it is. And when you get different ammo, 22 ammo, it has slight differences in it, which causes different shocks, and it runs at slightly different speeds, and all of a sudden 1 feet per second different, or 5 feet per second different, or 20 feet per second different, that starts to get into a group where it suits a particular part of the rifle. Only noted by people who are looking for lots of accuracy but trying to get small groups, they'll use different ammo. And that's actually about lining up those bits and pieces, and it's all about that shock that's traveling through the barrel. Another one in the 22 world, which goes into the movement of things, is people who have ever tried to shoot the 750 feet per second ammo. So it's the quiet 22 ammo. And you notice if you first use it, and you give it to some people, use it's nice and quiet, and they use it, it shoots terribly. In actual fact, most times when it shoots really terribly, it can be that it's a little less power, a little less consistent. But the biggest thing that actually is generally going on is you'll find their trigger control or their follow through isn't perfect. So they're lifting their finger straight off, or they're doing something. When you get that same shooter and you get them to squeeze and hold and do exactly the same thing, they find their group tightens up. All of a sudden it starts shooting better. And that's because the little movement they were doing was affecting the rifle to move before the bullet had got out of the muzzle. And that was what was causing the really terrible group. Okay, so those are with the 22 side of things. And I also touched on there your load development. It's another thing that people have seen. Load development. Why would different powder levels give you a better group or a worse group? In the simple all lined up principle, then it would be a case of some would be a little higher because it's going a little faster, and some would be a little lower and a little lower and a little lower, and it would just be, if you've got irregular stuff, then you just have irregular height. But of course that's not how load development works. You end up with larger groups or smaller groups. That's actually talking about those shocks, harmonics, and lining up nodes to try and get that same thing. Get it to the extremity of one of those things where there's less movement and you'll get a better group. People have really analysed it and done that on a paper where they can see, they'll find that their groups also grouping in different, if they go to the centre mass of the group, they're in different places around the zero. If they're always holding on the crosshairs on the zero on the target, one place, they'll find it'll actually group in different places because it is going to a different section of where it's going in that rifle, in that with the shock through that barrel. And another one that's everyone's seen, I've got a little list here, I'll just go through that sort of stuff. You'll tend to find, well, the different ammo side of things, that's when I'm with the 22 side of it, that is very relevant for, there are people who'll find ammo that shoots in their centerfire as well. This is much about the same thing. This is not about this match between that bullet and that barrel, that bullet and that action, that sort of stuff. It's actually about lining up the vibrations. Of other ones that are there, different, that's a very common one, the different grip side of things. For most people who've actually tried to make a rifle shoot properly, unless you're very well sorted in what you're doing, then you'll find, and when you're training people, you'll find as well, they're doing this with their rifle and they're getting this sort of group. You change the grip, whether it's a little firmer, a little looser, it's a little more shoulder impact, a little more shoulder tension, a little more preload, a little whatever it is, and they find I shoot this rifle this way and it shoots better. Once again, if it was simply a vector between the two, then why would it change anything? It's once you're holding it there, the trigger brake's in the right place, it's pointing at the target. If it's waving around, you can't aim very well. Okay, that's a different deal. But this is where it's all working properly. You're doing exactly the same thing in your aim and your trigger release and all that follow through and all that sort of stuff. And actually a different grip can affect a rifle. This is also why part of the free floating a barrel. Yes, there is the level of, if you're using the forend differently, then it's putting different load on the barrel and it can move it in the action, that sort of stuff. But there's also when you're doing everything right, but it's just irregular, and this is that shock as it travels up and down the barrel. If it's rubbing on something, then it makes an extra vibration, which causes then extra irregularity in where the bullet releases. Another one that we'll go through briefly there is the sporter barrel. A sporter barrel, and it starts to shoot irregularly. This is actually, once it's got more than 3 shots, some more than 2 shots, some more than 5 shots, but a nice skinny barrel, generally a fairly high power hunting cartridge, that sort of things, and they're only good for a couple of shots because after that they start to go all over the place. What's actually talking about there, once again, if it's a vector, it's not this barrel starts pointing in different places. What actually is that the harmonics or the shock affects a thin barrel even more because the thin barrel's heating up fast to start off with, but it's got less torsional strength, less strength in holding itself in the right place. So that means then those shock waves are actually the molecules touching against each other that travel it up and back is where those shock waves come from. Once the barrel gets hotter, the molecules start to get more active, you end up where even more is happening. You'll end up where there's a whip actually happening as that shock goes up and back in a sporter barrel. Stuff that has been seen, hard to pick up, very fine details, only talking thous of movement, but it starts to affect it even more. Once again, if it was just a vector, why would it change? And I think that is, listen, that's a list of bits and pieces I got there. I'm sure there's a few more that I've got rattling around my head that I can't bring up at the moment. But the logic of this is simply that the rifle is a dynamic thing. When it's being fired, it is dynamic. It isn't alive, but it is moving. There is a rapid expansion of girth, there's a whole heap of shock happening, there's a whole heap of force that is beginning. The recoil, largely, most of what you see has happened after the bullet's left, but prior to it leaving, it has started, those movements have started. The likes of, even down to how you grip and how you hold and all that sort of stuff, that is affecting not just the recoil behavior, but also the shock. If you notice that in various forms, if you have a cymbal ringing or a bell ringing or a triangle ringing or something like that, we have the ringing. That is actually that's shock going through there and you're hearing it. You put your hand against it where it's hanging off a piece of string like a triangle or a bell. It was making a whole lot of noise. The way you stop it making noise is you simply absorb it by touching it with your body. The fleshy, squishy human holds it, it absorbs all that vibration. Well, the same thing's going on versus a rifle that's sitting in a lead sled, largely so the logic is it's being completely insulated by the human, so the human can't mess it up, so it's going to shoot perfectly. I would say there's a little bit the opposite. The human is the bit that absorbs a whole heap of that shock. We are the big squishy dampener, the best squishy dampener we've got when it comes to firearms. It's how they were designed. When you put it in a lead sled and you hardly touch it and you make it go bang, then you're making that vibration happen as bad as it can. When you pick it up and shoot it, not only do you may have pressures in different places, not only recoil control different, that side of things, but you're also absorbing a whole heap of that shock. So that, yes, through the stock and through the chassis, through the action, that sort of stuff, that is still drawing that vibration out of there. And I then could go on for hours and hours of all the different things that happen with all the different points of shooting. So ultimately, this video is not trying to tell you you're doing anything wrong, but to try and explain what that's about. If your stuff is perfect, you're shooting 1/4 inch groups all day, no matter how you do it, then awesome, wonderful. You're a very special individual and that's working really well for you. But for those that want to understand this, what it is, and especially this whole vector, that they're lined up, so why would they ever move? Because it's not a static object. It actually is dynamic when it goes bang, and those dynamics are what we're trying to make behave in exactly the same fashion. So thick barrels and well set up stocks and recoil control and tuners or load development or preload or all those things are trying to little bit control and a little bit dampen is one of the ways I look at the shock and control and the recoil, making it all straightforward and that sort of stuff. But they will make it all behave very accurately and keeping in a straight line. But the main thing you want is consistency. If it does exactly the same thing every time, then that's when a really good group comes from, and that's when a zero is true. A zero is true. If the rifle behaves exactly like it did when you zeroed it, when you go and take that shot out at 300 or 400 or 600 yards, and that really matters, then that, or 1,000 yards and target side of things, if it behaves exactly the same, then that's a true zero. A static zero is a different creature. It's in a different mode. Anyway, that's that one there. I hope it makes some sense. I'm sure there'll be a fair bit to talk about that sort of stuff. That is definitely to follow on with that. I was inspired by those sort of comments, and hopefully there's something in there for guys who are trying to get that across, that they can make sense and help it get across to the folks that are having problems elsewhere. Anyway guys, thank you very much for checking in. Hope you liked the video, and we'll catch you next time.